Welcome everyone to day 2 of the SAIS CARI annual conference, presented this year as a series of webinars over a period of 8 days. My name is Jyhjong Park and I'm the Associate Director here at CARI. As some of you may know, the annual CARI conference has become, since the very first one held in 2014, one of the premier places to bring together new, cutting-edge empirical research on China-Africa relations with the Washington, D.C.'s think tank and policymaking communities. One of the few advantages of moving our in-person conferences onto a virtual webinar platform is that we've been able to expand our audiences well beyond the D.C. area. And for those of you logging in from different time zones across the globe, a very warm welcome. The CARI conference provides a platform to feature the work of the current year's class of CARI research fellows and to bring them in conversation with other experts in the field. This year on the topic of security matters involving Africa, China, and other partners. As Professor Browdigam mentioned yesterday, especially with rising tensions between China and multiple Western partners, research on Africa-China relations, security matters and security interests are clearly timely and important. Indeed, even in this time of COVID-19, racial tensions, wildfires, and hurricanes, this is incredibly important. Before I introduce today's panel and our moderator discussant, I wanted to briefly cover a few basics. Our program associate, Marie, will be including links of speaker bios and additional information in the chat as we go. However, the chat function will not be available to our viewers. If you have questions, you can type these into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And our panelists will do their best to answer as many of these as time permits. If they can, they may answer some of these live in the chat, in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll hold the questions till the very end. Please note that when you're typing your questions, be very clear to whom you are addressing your questions and comments. Some of the papers that are being presented today and throughout the conference have already been uploaded to our CARI website, and links have been included in the registration program. There will be several others that should be finalized in the coming weeks. However, please note that some of these are still works in progress and may not be available immediately. To balance that out, we will have recordings of each day events, and these will be made available typically about 3 to 5 days after the event. These links will be up on our website. With that, again, welcome to everybody. Today's panel is Security Engagement, Military Exports, and Arms Sales. And to introduce our panelists and their papers, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Phillip Saunders. Dr. Saunders is the director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. He is co-editor of the PLA Beyond Borders, Chinese Military Operations in Regional and Global Context, which is due to come out later this year. So we're very fortunate indeed to have him. And Dr. Saunders, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Hopefully I am unmuted and visible now. Let's see. Okay, am I visible? Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Jyhjong Huang, who's a PhD student in International Relations and Comparative Politics at Ohio State University. Her research interests include the international politics of foreign aid, international development, and international cooperation. She previously worked as CARI's senior research assistant and also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Namibia. Jyhjong, go ahead.
All right, can everyone hear me now? I'll take that as a yes. And screen share will start now. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint slides currently being shared Today I will be talking about the logic of arms deals, multi-level evidence from China-Zambia relations. Let me just double check the technology is going well. Okay. So today, this particular topic seems orthogonal to a lot of the research we do, just because it seems very specific. It's specific to China and specific to Zambia, but I think there are a lot of lessons that could be learned in terms of cooperation between large countries and developing countries. So the puzzle where we're faced with Zambia is the biggest recipient of Chinese loans for military procurement. And why is that? Zambia is not at war externally nor internally, and usually we associate military hardware purchases with geostrategic conflicts, right? So since Zambia is not a geostrategic hotspot, and by that I am comparing Zambia to countries like Djibouti. So why is Zambia the biggest recipient for military procurement loans? And Zambia is a landlocked country. It's not exactly located. It's not located in the Horn of Africa, nor other places where conflicts gets featured in the media a whole lot. In terms of loans, using China-Africa Research Initiative data, Chinese loans to Africa has soared since the 2000s. And most of it went to infrastructure development. So we're looking at the breakdown here for transportation, like railroads, roads, power plants, and mining. However, a portion of that went to military projects. And you can see that Zambia here took almost 50% of the Chinese loans for military procurement in Africa. Other countries had some share, but you can see Zambia took the lion's share of those loans. So why should we care about this topic? So military procurement, especially between China and developing countries in this case, they're contentious and they're an unfamiliar international phenomena. And these things tend to generate knee-jerk responses and throwaway explanations. So these knee-jerk responses I'm referring to, it could be, oh, it must be corruption. It must be corruption on both sides. It must be because they have expansionary intentions, so on and so forth. But these throwaway explanations only serves to misinterpret true intentions and obscure important policy implications. So the research that my working paper is based on, which is currently available for download on CARI's website, consists of elite interviews in Lusaka, Zambia in June and December of 2019, all conducted in English and complemented by desk research. So what I'm trying to argue here for today is that there needs to be a holistic approach to understanding this kind of bilateral relations. Usually when we think of military procurement, we think strategic immediately. So what are the wars being fought? What are these military weapons being used on? And then the second most common one, well, what about corruption? What about untransparent deals? So those are the domestic political economy side of things. And here I'm arguing for, well, there are also historic, systemic, and psychological factors to these deals that we're seeing. So these are the orders that the Zambian Air Force, so today we're focusing specifically on Air Force procurement, just because they are the bulk of what Zambia has been using Chinese loan for. So we can see here, these are the Zambian Air Force ZAF orders from China. These are the ones made after 2000. So you can see here, we have airliners. These are just regular passenger transport, light transport aircrafts, and trainer light attack. These are dual purpose aircrafts for training pilots, but you can also use them to a lesser extent in combat as well. Then you have the military utility helicopters, and then supersonic trainers, which it has more combat capability than your regular dual purpose trainer light attacks. And as you can see on the last column right here, these are all funded by loans of some sort. They could be from the Export-Import Bank of China, which is the policy bank, one of the two policy banks of China, or they were funded by suppliers credits, which is when the aircraft exporter themselves offer loans for these purchases. So these are the AVEC loans you see at the end, with AVEC being the aircraft exporter. So, and what is the context, right? So we have all these Chinese aircrafts But what are the other things that Zambia is also buying at the same time? So you look at all the orders made of military aircraft since the 2000, China still consists of the bulk of it. I think 50% of their, in terms of units of aircraft bought, are from China. But in there you still have other suppliers such as Italian suppliers, Russian suppliers, and even US suppliers for business jets. So what is the historical aspect we are looking at? So what happened in the past that may have contributed to this phenomenon we're seeing today? And what I'm arguing here is historical experiences, especially events after independence in 1964 by Zambia, contributed greatly to Zambia's need, either real or perceived, for military aircraft capabilities. So after the unilateral declaration of independence by the white minority in present-day Zimbabwe, Zambia immediately requested UK support because at the time they still had military cooperation with the UK. But however, the British side was dragging their feet when it comes to this issue. And in fact, there are British soldiers and aircraft sent there that were openly fraternizing with the Zimbabwe side. And why was what was happening in Zimbabwe an issue for Zambia? It was because Zambia at the time was hosting Black-led revolutionary movements. And in fact, Rhodesia at the time, present-day Zimbabwe, took control of Zambia's airspace for 48 hours. And the Zambian Air Force at the time couldn't do anything. They obeyed the broadcast advice by the Rhodesian forward controller and stayed grounded. And at the same time, there was an embargo of oil import and copper export on Zambia because at the time, Zambia was heavily reliant on the railway going through Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe. So not only were there air incursions, they were also being embargoed. And the oil import and copper export was the lifeline of Zambia at the time. So you can see the picture here on the top. That was the oil airlift by the US and the UK from Tanzania. And the thing is, this obviously airlift of oil is, the amount is negligible to what Zambia needed. And in fact, Zambia had to request access to the port of Beira in the Portuguese-controlled Mozambique, which was very uncomfortable because at the time, Portuguese-controlled Mozambique was considered a remnant of colonial control. And request for Air Force equipment from the US and the Soviet has been rebuffed. And so Zambia was in a tight space at the time. And that was when China stepped in to build the Tanzam Railway, which was, as far as Zambia was concerned, an alternative to airlift and railway through Zimbabwe. And what was in it for China? So there are multiple explanations today. So today we're taking a point of view from Zambia's perspective and not from Chinese perspective, but there are a couple of explanations. It could be their interest in having a more prominent role in the non-aligned movement. It could be ideological affinity for independent movements or their desire to increase spheres of influence. But in terms of effects, good PR, good public relations can be recycled and used for a long time. That photograph you see on the page at the bottom, that is a photograph of the construction of the Tanzam Railway. And that photograph has been recycled repeatedly. If you work in China-Africa issues, you've probably seen this picture before. So, good PR can go a long way, although the question is, the generation of political leaders in Zambia who have memory of Chinese support during their embargo, they are retiring or passing away. So one wonders whether it's a generational memory or not, and whether the younger generation of diplomats would give as much credit to that. So that is the historical aspect. The strategic aspect, we will look at, so what are the current strategic concerns for Zambia? The border with DRC is right now strategically the primary concern, especially in terms of spillovers from civil unrest. Back in 2017, 15,000 refugees have been registered in the Kanani Transit Center in Luapula Province, close to the border. So for that purpose, for the purpose of border control, were the aircrafts that Zambia purchased right for the job, and was it cheap for what you could have gotten otherwise? So I've interviewed military experts around, and I showed them the list of military aircraft spots. Like, considering border security with the DRC and civil unrest, were these good matches for the job? And for the most part, they are, except for the supersonic trainers, which will probably be better explained by Quest for Prestige, which will be addressed later. And in general, in places where ground transportation is difficult, which is common in Africa, airlift capability is especially important. So when the roads get washed out in the rainy season, you will need these aircraft for transport. So strategically, yes, these are fairly good purchases, and for the price they can get, I did comparisons of aircraft of similar purposes, and they were pretty good matches. So what are the political economy side of things? So the Zambian Air Force, they have a special role in Zambia. They are simultaneously one of the biggest formal job employers, housing provider. They're also responsible for staffing the national airline when the national airline was still in operation. And they were also a property developer. So at the top of the picture you see right there, that is a joint venture between the Zambian Air Force and Chinese property development companies to build that was Green City Village, but there is also one next to Green City Village of similar purpose called Kingsland, which is a multi-purpose development. These include parks, schools, sports fields, shopping centers. And obviously these are contentious deals, especially with Kingsland City private-public partnership due to its location on a national forest. And then there's also concern for fiscal responsibility. Zambia is currently faced up with the deadline for the Eurobond. And the thing is, military aircraft purchases aren't cheap. They're not a big drain, but the thing is they don't come under parliamentary scrutiny. So you have aircrafts, some of them may be important for strategic purposes, and then you have purchases of presidential business jets that receive a lot more public backlash. There were almost no backlash with the purchase of supersonic jets, even though they might be for prestige purposes. And then there is the state-corporate relations. We're looking at, AVEC has a very prominent role in Zambia, and they are considered the jack of all trades, the company to go to. And that has generated a lot of ill will in other sectors of construction where people perceive them as hogging all the construction deals. But the thing is, this is a carefully cultivated image that AVEC has developed, where they initially entered Zambia with the support of Export-Import Bank loans, but now they're ready to hold their own by offering their own loans and branching out into different sectors of development. I'm gonna speed up a little bit because I know I'm short on time. And then finally, the fourth logic is the psychological quest for prestige. And that is not for me, I think that's a very common one for countries around the world. You think about the Blue Angels in the US Air Force, they have no combat capability. And the thing is, most of their performance is domestic. It is prestige, inward-looking prestige for the domestic. And it's the same thing for Zambia as well. They've hosted open houses in Lusaka where they park their military jets on the tarmac and the public can come to see, even board some of them. And so even though they might be expensive and they might have narrow utility needs, Zambia is not unlikely to do dogfights with any other country's military anytime soon. But it is a point of national pride, just like Zambia's participation in peacekeeping missions, as well as their attempt to revive their national airline. These are points of pride for Zambia. So down there you can see the training of pilots in China after they purchased the supersonic jets and the handover of the supersonic jets a few years later. And finally, there are systemic considerations. So after logics 1 through 4, the question might be, the wrong question seems to be, why did Zambia buy jets from China, but why didn't Zambia buy more jets? Why when we look at the table on the top, they still bothered to buy from Italy and Russia and the US? And the thing is, Zambia, in fact, by virtue of being a country that is not in a geostrategic hotspot, actually has a lot more leeway to cooperate with international players, even if those international players are not on the best of terms. So Zambia receives a lot of military training from the US, they requested it. In terms of peacekeeping, in terms of border control. So there's a picture on the top that's from the US AFRICOM of Zambian personnel receiving training. But that doesn't mean that military cooperation with the US will necessarily means no cooperation with China. So down there you see the military attaché from China receiving a Medal of Honor from the president for training their police force. And in terms of policy relevance, obviously procurement needs to align with your geostrategic defense plans. There are always criticism, no matter what kind of military procurement, there will always be criticisms. And obviously they cannot be completely transparent, but some level of accountability is needed, or else you will have essentially a budget hold that can't be accounted for. And that's important for Zambia during a time of fiscal crises. And for Chinese companies, for a long time, acquiring more contract was the gold standard of whether a company is successful. But I think AVIC has come to realize that a single-minded pursuit for more contracts might actually generate ill will on the ground for monopolizing construction business. And I will go through these very fast because I'm short on time. The US military, so what role has US left now? It seems like China is taking over military export and it's taking over construction. And I think as US military training in counterterrorism, peacekeeping, and border security are things that, at least for now, the Chinese cannot match due to partly their concern for the non-interference policy. So I will pause here and see the ground to other people. If you have questions, you're welcome to post it in Q&A. Thank you. And thank you, obviously, to SAIS CARI for supporting this research, Ohio State University as well, and last but not least, the people of Zambia who were incredibly generous with their time and patience with me.
Okay, Phil Saunders here, trying to get my video going, but it seems like the audio is working, so I'll go ahead and do the introduction. Next, we have Dr. Elijah MUNYI, who's Assistant Professor of International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi. His latest publication is the book Beyond History, African Agency and Development, Conflict Resolution and Diplomacy. And his research interests include Africa's international economic relations, China-Africa relations, and Africa's general positioning in managing the emerging great power competition. Dr. MUNYI, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saunders. I'm trying to have my video on, yes. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm in Nairobi, and it's afternoon, evening almost here. My presentation is titled Challenging Pax Americana, the Commercial Imperative in Chinese Arms Exports to Africa, a case study of Uganda and Kenya. And I think from my presentation, you will hear of a lot of similarities and perhaps things that might sound like repetition from what Jyhjong has presented. What my paper was trying to do is to handle these three questions. What is driving the African state's preference for Chinese arms? So basically, the same thing of probably like Jyhjong did with Zambia, but I was doing that with Uganda and Kenya. So why are more African countries, which many of them have been called new emergent customers? So when you look at before 2005, a lot of countries, African countries, would be buying arms from either Russia or US and the West, actually mostly European, not so much the US, but European countries, including smaller sort of Caucasus country, Belarus and Czech Republic and those kinds of countries. But increasingly over the last 20 years, since 2005, there's been a lot of shift towards China. And the question is, why do African countries seem to be making this shift? Part of my paper also wanted to look at, does this increasing purchase of Chinese arms have anything to do with democratic consolidation in African states? This is an old question, which mostly has been fueled by, I think, perceptions that China somehow contributes to lack of democratic progress by being very cozy to presidents and militaries of certain countries, which are not seen as democratic. And then the final question was, what impact does this increasing purchase of Chinese military hardware have on two aspects. One on relations between the great powers. So are the great powers sort of getting uneasy about how much, so for instance, does the US care about how much Chinese arms Uganda imports, or how much does China care about how much of American military hardware Kenya gets, or Zambia for that matter? So one is, what is the impact of this procurement on great power relations? And two, on bilateral relations between, for example, Uganda and Kenya with the US, and Uganda and Kenya with China. So does US really get perturbed by the increasing purchase of Chinese goods, Chinese military hardware by these two countries? So the justification for this is twofold. One is theoretical, one is policy. And I'll start with the theoretical one. There's consensus in literature on the idea of arms sales as tools of foreign policy. So the US does this. They have done this for many years in the Middle East. And actually the title of the word Pax Americana is borrowed from this idea of the US using military sales as a foreign policy tool for regional balancing. So they'll sell to Iran, they'll sell to Saudi Arabia, they'll sell to India, they'll sell to Pakistan, they'll sell to Algeria, they'll sell probably to Morocco, in a manner that they think enhances regional balance. So the problem with this, or the implication of this, is if we've got countries increasingly purchasing arms from China, does that somehow change the regional balance in the eyes of the US, for example? Or does it shape, or is China interested, in fact, in shaping the same thing in terms of regional balancing and so on? So there is this, at least literature, consensus in literature about that. And therefore, there is a concern about who is selling arms to who. Is it Russia selling mostly, or is it China, or is it America? The second one is the factual part about the rise in Chinese procurement. So when you look at 2005 or up to 2010, the total sub-Saharan arms acquisition, China had only about 10%. 10 years later, in 2020, well, actually 2019, China's share of procurement has risen to 19%. And the US actually only seems to be a big player in North Africa, the 5 countries of North Africa, where it's got about 15% at the moment. So this is as of now. And the question is, what is driving this increase? And China actually seems to be the leader in terms of how much it's making more, it's enhancing its market share of arms. So the justification for the question is that we see a China that is doing very well in terms of arms sales in Africa, but at the same time we see a US which is rather uneasy about this increased sales. And I think part of the reason why the US is very jittery about the growth of Chinese exports is the tendency for the US to look at arms sales in a strategic way. So how do these arms contribute to regional balancing or to the balance of power with other powers? And the fact that China seems to be increasing these sales causes this tendency for the US to look at it like this. Of course, the US has also said that they want to have a more commercial imperative in Africa. So the 2018 US Africa policy is got a more commercial drive. So perhaps understanding why China is selling would be of interest to the US. So my study, unlike Jyhjong's, which actually touches on more or less the same things, but my study was trying to sort of rank. So I put the question to, I did this study in Kenya and Uganda, And my question was to some procurement officials from the military and also the state, the civil service, of what drives their procurementization to get military equipment from China or other places to understand. And I had this idea of sort of ranking the indicators or the drivers for procurementizations in a sort of more hierarchical order. So for me, I found that these are the most important things. So starting with the first, cost seemed to be the most important consideration. And this is interesting because it helps us understand it's not so much because China is pushing to sell, but China is attractive because it's cheaper. Just something like that has also come from Jyhjong's presentations. Then secondly, so cost is the most crucial. Then number two is oversight, which is a big problem. So oversight means to what extent do we feel that the selling country, so China or the US in this case, is very much interested in oversighting us or in following how we use the end user of the product that we buy. And this was a big attraction for African countries to buy from China because China doesn't seem to be interested in how they use their arms, their military equipment. The United States, on the other hand, is very interested in actually how the end user, and this to me looked like it's the biggest problem for the United States. So partly because the United States adherence to human rights and governance issues and so on, it's also become an Achilles heel in terms of their ability to sell arms. So the US has a very attractive program called Foreign Military Sales, which is a government-to-government sales procurement system where a country like Kenya or Uganda can order arms from the US through this system. But that system goes through so much oversight from state, from defense, and from Congress that by the time you have made progress, it's 3 years down the line and still you haven't gotten your Y-12s or any military aircraft. So it's a big problem for the US. Then number three, what drives countries to buy from China or elsewhere is the kind of financial incentives attached to that military sale. And when it comes to the Chinese, their big incentive from the two countries that I spoke to was their willingness to adjust the military equipment, for instance, aircraft. They are willing to change systems or put other systems that make the aircraft more, so improves the operability of that aircraft. So that is a big incentive from the Chinese, which doesn't seem to be, the US side doesn't seem to be as willing to do any kind of adjustments to the equipment. And then finally is political and military relations. So this sometimes you might tend to think political and military relations are so important, but actually according to the two countries, the answers that I was getting from both state officials and military officials is that actually that may not be so important. I think it's going to change, but at least as of now, it didn't seem to be like it didn't seem to be, the determining factor as cost is. And the interesting thing is that when I spoke to the two countries, there was a lot of recognition of the importance of US military diplomacy. So all the peacekeeping and training that the US does around the two countries, but that actually didn't seem to translate in terms of their willingness to buy from the US. Mostly, I think, because of cost. So in terms of the order, those seems to be what came out from our interviews. Now, just to discuss some takeaways, particularly in terms of the general view of African arms importation from China and how it relates to US, China, and US, let's say, Uganda relations. So the first takeaway was that China is actually not a great competitor in terms of the greatest arms buyers in Africa. So China is essentially not really competing with the US in terms of who is the biggest arms importer. So those are the North African states. And when we are coming to that, and we'll see the data shows that China is actually not a very big competitor there. So number two, the real casualty of growing Chinese arms exports to Africa is actually Russia. And number three, great power politics in arms procurement tends to favor US and Russia and not China. So number one, China doesn't really compete against the US. So this is a graph of the biggest arms importers in Africa, starting with China, Algeria, Morocco, Angola, then Nigeria, the top five importers. So these are the numbers in terms of the total arms imports, in terms of both finance, the money, and the capability. So Egypt is the leading, and for instance, Nigeria is number 5. And so what I did here was to put the top 3 suppliers of, for instance, Egypt, the top 3 suppliers here of Algeria. So the top 3 suppliers of Egypt, for instance, is Russia, then France, then the United States. And then China has a little bit, yeah? And the Chinese share, as you can see from Egypt, for example, is 0.48. So it's not even 1% of the total share of Egyptian arms. In Algeria, China is doing a little bit better because it's the number 2 provider. And as you can see here, the US doesn't feature. Yeah, so it's still Russia, then China, then Germany, and so on. The Chinese percentage is 12, it's high. For Morocco, you can see the main supply is the US and China doesn't feature. Number 4, Angola, China has a 5% stake. And number 5 is Nigeria, where they have about a 20% stake. So the thing is, if we compare the top 5 with the next list of the number 6 to number 12, basically you see China becomes a major arms supplier to the what I call the second tier from number 6 to going down. So what this tells me is that, so for instance, if you look at Cameroon, Senegal, Zambia, yeah, and Ethiopia and Tanzania, China has a big chunk of the national supply in these countries, upwards of 20%, 40%, 48% in Cameroon, and so on. So China is not really competing so much in these countries, which are the top buyers, which I think is because of the strategic nature. So these countries' arms imports are driven to arms imports and arms sales. So both by Russia and the US, they are driven by some kind of strategic interest in balancing, for instance, Algeria and Morocco conflicts. And I think China doesn't really like to get involved in these kind of proxy conflicts. So China avoids a lot of supply here, but China is doing very well in the second tier. And this is to show that actually this from the movement from 10% to, so sort of to say this movement from 10% to 19% in recent years is probably mostly driven by the second tier countries, the number 6s to number 20 and so on. So, and most of these are sub-Saharan African countries, which, as Jyhjong has said, do not have any sort of interstate conflicts. So this is where China seems to thrive. In places where there is interstate conflict, China doesn't seem to do very well. Those countries prefer to procure from China, from the US.
Elijah, you're running
Yes?
out of time. Can you take 1 or 2 more minutes and wrap up, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
So I'll skip that. And then just go to the recommendations, because I've discussed the findings. One, the recommendations are in the background of what we see as a more assertive foreign policy for both China and the US in Africa. So both of them seem to be becoming more assertive. And based on that growing assertiveness of the two countries, China and the US should actually see each other more as partners in driving down the Russian dominance of arms in Africa rather than competitors. So they are not really competing. They are mostly going to bring down the Russian dominance. There's need for a multilateral agreement, for instance, the Arms Trade Treaty, which is being negotiated and which China is a part of, the US is not a part of, but we need a multilateral treaty for making sure that we don't have an unregulated sale of military equipment to African countries. Because if both countries, if China and the US both adopt a very commercial approach, then we are likely to see sort of a pileup of military equipment in Africa, which actually may not be so necessary, as we've seen with Zambia. Then great power competition will likely precipitate aspects of alliancing in arms sales. So as these two countries become more assertive, we also expect that they will require countries to sort of declare where you stand, and African countries should be ready for that. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm trying to start video, but again, I'm going to do the introduction and not wait for it. Next, we have Tom Bays, who's a China-Africa researcher, most recently with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Berlin. He previously worked for an Africa-focused consultancy in London and on EU-Africa policy at the UK Perm Rep to the EU in Brussels. So Tom, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saunders, and hello, everybody. And in my case, it's greetings from Berlin, so hello to wherever you are. Firstly, thank you to our hosts for inviting me to present today, and thank you, of course, to everybody in the audience for joining. So what I'll be presenting in the next 15 minutes is a report entitled China's Growing Security Role in Africa, Views from West Africa, Implications for Europe, which was published in July by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation together with MERICS. As I think the quite broad sounding title indicates, the project had quite a wide scope and was aiming to look at the various dimensions of China's security role in Africa as seen in the case of the sub-region of West Africa as a whole. And so as such, I look in the report at dimensions including China's participation in UN peacekeeping, its military diplomacy, its military capacity building, and of course its arms transfers. So in this presentation, I will touch on all of those, but of course, given it's the topic of today's session, I will focus in a bit more detail on the arms transfer point. But also, as you can, I think, tell from the title, one of the aims of the project was to try and get a sense of how China is perceived as a security partner in West Africa amongst West African decision makers. And so I will conclude with some of the key points on that topic. Before getting stuck in, then a quick comment on the methodology. So the report is based on fieldwork undertaken in these 8 West African countries as marked on the map. And there I interviewed a range of individuals, so notably West African government officials, particularly from foreign and defense ministries, senior West African military officers, officials from relevant international organizations, West African politicians, international diplomats and military attaches, as well as African and international NGOs, researchers, and civil society organizations. So turning to the findings then, firstly on military diplomacy, West Africa has seen in recent years a definite uptick in China's military diplomacy, which is, I think, clearly aimed at trying to boost China's visibility as a security partner. So tangibly, that has meant more Chinese military attaches posted in the sub-region, an increase in high-level exchanges of security and military officials and indeed ministers. We've also seen port visits by the PLA Navy, and China has also signed a number of defense and security cooperation MOUs with countries in the region. And then also, I think interestingly, beyond pure military diplomacy, in other areas of diplomatic exchanges, such as presidential visits, there's also been a noticeable increased emphasis placed on security cooperation. And throughout all of this, Beijing's rhetoric on the nature of its security role is fairly consistently that it is about helping to build capacity to support African solutions to African problems, that it only engages in restricted multilateral intervention, i.e. peacekeeping, and that this security cooperation is an important building block of a China-Africa community with a shared future. So I've mentioned peacekeeping there. I know that there will be a session next week on peacekeeping, so I will limit my points here to a few key points. So firstly, West Africa serves as quite a good indication of the way that China's participation in UN peacekeeping has grown and evolved in recent years. So if we have a look at the map here on the right-hand screen, on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see that what began in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire with a handful of military observers, then in Liberia became medical, engineering and police personnel numbering in the several hundreds. And then of course in Mali, MINUSMA, that key step of providing armed infantry in the shape of a small security unit up in Gao. So China certainly does highlight this contribution within its public diplomacy and its diplomatic messaging within West Africa, and that's of course part of this broader global effort to as Chinese state media have self-identified China as the backbone of UN peacekeeping. So certainly this role has grown, but I think it's important to see the limitations still. A number of the interviewees on the ground in Mali felt that China's participation was largely symbolic, important symbolism, but still symbolic. And that does chime with what I think we can say has been an only incomplete embrace by China of peacekeeping norms, and what we're of course now seeing an increasing desire to reshape UN peacekeeping policy and norms. But as I say, there will be a panel next week, so I will leave those points to the panelists talking on that next week. Before coming to the arms transfer topic, a really key element of China's security role in West Africa, as indeed in the rest of the continent, is military training and capacity building. And this is certainly a dimension that the Chinese side really strongly emphasizes. But what I think is really important to recognize is the specificities of China's approach, or indeed the limits of China's approach on this in this area, certainly where compared to other of Africa's international partners. So the key characteristic here is that China's contribution is very heavily focused on the training of African officers taking place in China at Chinese institutions, and indeed largely paid for by generous Chinese government scholarships. So this is a large and growing and largely well-received program. And so in West Africa, it cuts across that important Francophone, Anglophone divide in a way that other partners don't necessarily do. And we're talking courses ranging in length from a couple of weeks all the way up to over a year. Now, in contrast, other forms of training, such as in-country training for enlisted ranks, are much more marginal. So within West Africa, we've seen some limited examples of China providing training in combat skills, for example, in Guinea. Slightly more commonly, we've seen examples of training in engineering, military engineering skills, and then more commonly still training in the use of newly acquired Chinese weapons. But as a whole, this remains quite limited, as indeed does China's first moves into joint exercises in West Africa, which so far have been limited to small naval exercises tacked on, as it were, to port visits that I mentioned earlier. So what we don't have here is a broad, large-scale security sector reform approach, as would be pursued, for example, by European actors. The EU mission in Mali has trained more than a third of Mali's armed forces, for example. And then we also don't see that kind of major programmatic annual joint exercises like the US leads in West Africa. So to me, this points to, for China, a priority perhaps as much on building influence amongst Africa's future military commanders as perhaps on building capacity per se. Now, getting finally to arms transfer, of course, a topic for today. West Africa here too serves as quite a good example and demonstration of what we've seen as China's emergence as the second largest arms supplier to sub-Saharan Africa. So within West Africa, Ghana and Nigeria are its principal customers, but these weapons, Chinese weapons, are present really throughout the sub-region. Small arms and light weapons, such as rifles, are key, are quite a fundamental element of these flows. But as I think many of you will be aware, there's quite low transparency in this area, so the flows are quite difficult to gauge. However, my interviews in a number of countries with Ministry of Defense officials and military officers confirmed that China is an important source in this market segment for many countries. But also in that other segment of major weapons, China is increasingly important as a supplier and provides increasingly sophisticated platforms. So that's what's illustrated on the map here, which is based on CIPRI data. And I think hopefully this map gives a bit of a sense both of the geographic spread of these transfers, but also the variety. So we're talking jets, helicopters, patrol vessels, and combat drones in the case of Nigeria. And what I would say is something that came through in the interviews that I had was that these flows are definitely being quite strongly encouraged by Beijing, that they're pushing into new markets. For example, Côte d'Ivoire previously has been focused more on suppliers such as France, but is moving towards Chinese supply. Or the case of Burkina Faso, for example, you'll note that that's not going to, a little logo or a little symbol on that map yet, but interviews with Burkina Faso, with Burkinabe politicians there, telling me that within months of Burkina Faso ending its relations with Taiwan in favor of Beijing, they had Chinese arms exporters reaching out to them for meetings to promote sales. And I think that China's motives in promoting these transfers are not especially mysterious. Of course, this offers revenues into China's military industrial modernization, but I think also really important to flag is that this offers also the feedback that comes from these weapons being exposed to actual combat, which unfortunately, of course, in West Africa is the case for a number of the militaries there facing up to very real security challenges. And that latter element of that feedback is something that some of the Chinese analysis, in particular academic analysis, points to as being an important motive. Next, I'd like to just flag the role of donations here. The map, I think, is probably a little bit too small to look at in any detail here, but I, of course, invite you to have a look in more detail within the written report, but hopefully it does give a bit of a sense of the spread and the scale of donations made by China in recent years to many West African militaries and indeed organizations, G5, ECOWAS. And we're talking here about both lethal and non-lethal military equipment, as well indeed as military infrastructure such as barracks, training facilities, and even in the case of Ghana, its Ministry of Defense headquarters building itself. Now, naturally, these donations can play political and diplomatic, can serve diplomatic goals, and that varies, I think, looking at the different specific examples. But to take one example I've already mentioned, in the run-up to Burkina Faso's decision to end ties, China quite successfully, with ties with Taiwan, China successfully leveraged the promise of support to the G5 Sahel to encourage Burkina Faso to switch sides. An interesting question here, and quite an important one, is the extent to which these donations are really need-driven, whether or not they're requested from the West African side saying this is what we need, or is it a question of getting rid of China, getting rid of surplus and maybe gaining some diplomatic benefits on top? To be honest, in the interviews there were examples and opinions that pointed in different directions. For example, ECOWAS, the donation made to ECOWAS seems to have been of quite limited utility, as I discussed in the written reports. But then in other cases, for example, patrol vessels for the littoral states who are facing piracy challenges, these were received more actively positively. A final point on arms supply then, and again an important one, is this question of quality, and this has been touched on a bit by the previous presenters, but as many of you will be familiar, General Townsend, the commander of US AFRICOM last year, told Congress that Africa's purchases of weapons from China, these purchases frequently do not address the underlying military need or indeed are of poor quality. And of course you say there's a political dimension to that kind of observation, but General Townsend is certainly not the only one to make this suggestion. So going into the research, this was a question that I wanted to explore in the interviews, and short answer would be that the fieldwork, to a large extent, confirmed this sort of assessment insofar as that interviewees in multiple countries were able to give numerous instances of malfunctions and failures, for example, of crashed jets, drones crashing in the case of Nigeria, patrol vessels breaking down when scrambled. And this, as my interviews showed, has led to some frustration within certain West African militaries and even active opposition in some cases to further Chinese purchases. But as we've heard as well from the previous presenters, that competitive price, that quick delivery that China promises, and also some of the other dimensions, the 5 different dimensions mentioned earlier, means that we're certainly not about to see the end of these transfers, certainly not anytime soon. And then, as mentioned at the start, I'll conclude with some comments on how China is perceived as a security actor within West Africa. Of course, I spoke to a range of individuals in a range of countries with correspondingly a range of opinions. But what I offer here are some of the commonalities that came out with some frequency in the interviews. So firstly, I think unsurprisingly, China is still seen principally as an economic partner, and that's likely to remain the case. It's not a first choice security partner in the way that the US or France are, and a number of interviewees mentioned its unwillingness or inability to deploy troops on the ground for in extremis intervention, as other powers have done, limits its status as a security partner, although of course that kind of external intervention is rarely, if ever, a preferred first choice. It's also not a first choice alternative military partner. It's rather Russia that gets mentioned there. Weapons I've discussed, certainly overall it's seen as positive opportunity for these militaries to boost their capabilities at quite accessible prices, if of course they prove reliable, but overall clearly seen as part of desirable diversification to have a balanced mix of suppliers. Chinese training is positively received, although many commentate it's just one amongst many suppliers and is less prestigious than some of the training institutions in the West. And a comment that came up frequently, variations on the theme of what can they teach us, so doubts about the PLA having relevant expertise and experience, especially on counterterrorism. Some interviewees also spoke about the values disconnect between Beijing and West Africa being increasingly pro-democratic and quite interventionist, and China's largely absent from that kind of civil society-led peace-building approach, which is quite important within West Africa. But despite those limitations, specificities of China's role, nonetheless, there was a clear sense that there's a growing expectation for China to have a greater role in West African and African security, and indeed already a sense in which China's considerable influence in other domains already boosts and magnifies its perceptions of its security role. But I will leave it at that and hand over back to you, Dr. Saunders. I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. And I think I'm waiting to have my video started. I've done my part. Trying to do my part again. Okay, so hopefully that's working. And I have comments on all the papers, probably more detailed than I have time for, so I will provide them separately via email. But let me start with Jyhjong's paper. I like the focus on a single country, but using multiple lenses to try to understand it thoroughly. Lots of detail. I learned lots of things from this paper. Very good statement of the puzzle that she's trying to address. I think each of the 5 aspects illuminated different aspects of arms sales, and each brought new information forward. And so I enjoyed that and learned something from it. However, at the end of the day, I'm a political scientist, and I'd still like to know, which factors are the most important. And I felt the paper shied away from this a little bit. It may well be the case that they reinforce each other, and that helps to answer the central question as you posed it. Why is Zambia a country that doesn't seem to be strategically that important for China? Why do they get the most loans for military purposes? But I think to really prove that, you would need to add a comparative perspective with another case and use these same 5 logics on other countries to see what are the values on them in other cases, and does that explain why Zambia is number one? A couple other points, sort of a tension between interoperability based on equipment from a single supplier and too much dependence. And it makes sense that countries would want to try to balance that. I liked in the paper the detailed effort to sort of vet each of the arms deals and compare the prices that China got from other countries and alternative arms systems. That was great. I liked your attention to the financial terms of the deal, and in particular whether suppliers' credits were a big part of that, but also whether the Chinese seller could offload the loan onto the development bank or the Exim Bank to put the risk on another Chinese actor. And in fact, you could interpret that in terms of sort of moral hazard questions. I like the comparison with Italy. So we see another supplier and how they interact with Zambia. And in fact, using commercial loans because they don't have ex-import bank-like things. And in fact, those loans are already in default. So that seems to be a point here about government support for these arms sales to a customer that doesn't have a lot of money and doesn't have a good credit record being really important. Struck by the importance of corruption and the evidence of it, and also the non-answers that the government gives to inquiries. It's a violation of security to talk about why we're leasing a luxury executive jet. But the bottom line, or one of the bottom lines for me, is this is a really risky buyer. Are any of these loans ever going to be paid back? And then the other question is, if price and financing are the dominant factors that make China really attractive, how much do the other logics matter at the end of the day? Let me turn to the next paper, Dr. MUNYI's paper. I'll try to pay a little more attention since it's in draft and there's still a chance for comments to help improve it in revisions. And I think this is generally set up quite well with a mix of quantitative and qualitative research methods and a comparison in it between Kenya and Uganda. One question I had was how relevant is the old literature on arms sales and influence, a lot of which dates back to Cold War days and bilateral competition between the US and the Soviet Union. It seems to me in the current environment, buyers have a lot more influence because everybody wants to sell and strategic considerations are less salient than they were. Apropos of that, I wasn't so persuaded by the citations and arguments about US arms sales and the regional security balance. In my experience, and I think to some degree suggested by your interviews, this is more of a negative test than a positive factor. Or to put that differently, the would-be seller has to say why selling a particular type of system will not upset the regional balance. Or same with domestic political conditions, the sale won't empower a dictator. So these are more negative tests that have to be met before an arms sale can be approved than positive motivations. And in some ways, I think profits, exports, and lowering unit costs are generally more important factors for US suppliers. But it's absolutely true that the fact that these aren't considerations for China removes a barrier to arms sales to non-democratic means. Your quantitative findings are interesting, no correlation between arms sales and decline in democracy freedom. But I think the question maybe there that's more interesting is whether regime type gives the PRC an advantage in making sales to non-democratic regimes. And it seems to me you could test that in the paper. You have the data to do that. It's just a little bit different question, but it would be interesting to see that. The interview data is really interesting here. I had a little trouble understanding how the categories of the answers, very significant, modestly significant, neutral, insignificant, map onto the presentation or the consolidation of the data in table 4, which just refers to given opinion. So it'd be helpful to me if you can explain how the answers in the interviews map onto the presentation of the findings in table 4 in a little more detail. Finding that cost and limited oversight are key factors, interesting, not surprising. There's an implicit finding here that US security assistance and cooperation programs are broader and more effective than China's. And I think Tom's data also sort of supports that. Your framework suggests that countries don't want to become too dependent on any one supplier, and thus there's a cap to diversification. I think that's an interesting finding. And of course, there's an inherent tension between diversifying suppliers so you're not dependent and wanting interoperability, which is easiest if everything comes from one country. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle. I'm left at the end of the day with a question about how important arms sales really are as a political strategic indicator in the current era. We can measure them, we can analyze them, we can research them, but what do they really tell us? And I think you suggest that the US has some inherent disadvantages in serving the African arms market based on what customers want and what they're able to pay, but that it compensates by using other security assistance tools. And I think that's a correct and important conclusion. And there's an interesting hint in your paper that US-China competition for influence in Africa might heat up in the future. You cite Trump administration strategy, in which case the aid portion could become a more significant factor. And I think a question you might speak is, does this give the buying countries more influence, the ability to play the US and China off against each other and get better terms from the US and China and maybe Russia too? It would be interesting to sort of speculate looking forward how these dynamics might differ from those in the Cold War period, the post-Cold War period, and then whatever the period that we are entering now with intensified strategic competition. So that's maybe something to think about going forward. Tom, this is a great paper. It's published, so it's not quite fair because you've already been through peer review and sessions and editing. So we have the final product from you in a way that we don't from the other presenters. But it is a tour de force, very comprehensive, like the approach, like the focus on the sub-region, which gives us a variety of countries, but makes it manageable. Great use of overall standard data sources, but then you supplemented that with individual research on countries and interviews. It's too rich to summarize. One of my takeaways, though, from it is certain tendencies, we might say. China likes to do things under UN auspices. It likes to engage with regional and sub-regional institutions. It likes bilateral programs direct with individual countries, but it wants political credit and influence for what it does. It's reluctant to cooperate with other donors or see its contributions watered down in a collective effort. There's a heavy focus on publicizing what it does to domestic, regional, and global audiences. And this publicity is somewhat independent of the actual results of what the programs achieve in terms of security. So they want credit for the inputs more so than the outputs. And also the importance of political separation from the US, the EU, and past colonial powers, I think was another theme that came out. I want to flag something from my own research on Chinese military diplomacy, which suggests there may be a shift from bilateral high-level mill-to-mill engagements to multilateral ones that place fewer demands on Chinese top military leaders. So things like the Forum on China-Africa Peace and Security Forum may substitute for bilateral meetings with individual countries. And you do a big forum like that, you deal with a bunch of countries at once, you have bilateral meetings on the margins, and then you don't have to meet with them individually. So that's kind of a new development. Liked your comparison between what China is doing, what the EU has done. I like the future orientation, looking at where things might develop, making some predictions about trends. A big question I was left with was the extent to which there's a pull of Chinese interests, which demand greater Chinese involvement in Africa, versus the push of China and the PLA wanting to take advantage of opportunities to strengthen their overseas role to advance either national interests or parochial military service interests. So, to what extent is this a pull of interests that have to be protected versus a push of actors wanting to play a greater role? And just to give an example, when we had, I think, Guobo Shang, the CMC vice chair, at NDU giving a public speech, he talked about how the counter-piracy threat in the Gulf of Aden was going away, but maybe there were still pirates in the Gulf of Guinea, so maybe the PLA Navy could go there next. And that sort of suggests that they were using this as an excuse to have a naval presence rather than a demand for it. I will wrap up with a couple overall comments. First, the importance of comparative perspective to put each country's experience and China's actions in perspective. I think all the papers did this to varying degrees. Questions about agency and analytical level. What's the level of analysis? Is it the international system? Is it US-China competition? Is it China's motivations? Is it subnational actors within China? Is it the recipient country? Is it subnational actors within the recipient country? And I think the papers actually had bits and pieces of all of those, but that's an important question. Yet I'm left with a takeaway. Each of those tells us something, but it's really, really important to have the perspective of the African countries and the region and to focus on their agency. I think if you look at it just what China is doing or just US-China competition, you miss an awful lot. And yet at the same point, that's a dynamic, the ability of countries to play the US, China, EU, UN, Russia off against each other to increase their leverage. And I think Dr. MUNYI's comments in his paper on oversight as a negative factor in US arms sales highlights one important thing, how China's greater role limits the US ability to impose conditionality or makes that a competitive disadvantage. In this case, in arms sales, but I think it's a broader point. Then on data, all of the papers make use of standard data sources like Comtrade and CIPRI database, but all of them also bring unique data from research or interviews to bear. Some use Chinese sources as well as English and other language sources. It's a challenge because some data is just not available or incomplete. Tom, you had all these interesting points from interviews, that sort of suggest things that are going on, but we can't have a comprehensive picture getting at it from that way. Nevertheless, what you bring to bear from that's really useful. And I think the other papers did that too in their interviews. So that's the fourth point here is the value of those interviews to really bring things out. And as Deborah said, and this is a question I'll kind of leave you guys with, but very few of those interviews with Chinese actors, or at least Chinese government actors. And so that's a question that, is that something really missing from the puzzle here or the research that you've been able to do? And is that because they're not willing to talk? They're not willing to talk on the record. It's too hard to get access to them. But that's a bigger question. What are we missing if we're not getting kind of those insights from inside the Chinese system rather than official documents? And then the last question I'll kind of bring to bear, which is a bigger picture one, is how much will increased US-China competitive dynamics change things in the future? Or is it a US, EU, China, Russia great power dynamic that matters more? It's just my sense that we had a Cold War bilateral dynamic, we had a post-Cold War era, we're headed into something else that is more competitive, and that may change the environment within which African countries are talking. Okay, so I will wrap up there with my comments, and I will send them to you later via email. I'm getting guidance that all panelists should turn on their cameras now, so let's do that. And let me start. My role now switches to sort of moderating on questions, but let me start by asking all the panelists to speak to Deborah's question. Were you able to get access to Chinese interviewees? If so, what did that tell you? If not, what do you think is missing from the story? And maybe let's go in presentation order. So Jyhjong, if you want to start.
Thank you, Dr. Saunders. So while I was in the field in Lusaka, I did attempt to get in contact with both the Chinese embassy as well as AVEC on the ground in Lusaka. No responses from them. And in terms of where to get Chinese interviews from, I think this part is very revealing. I managed to track down an office of AVEX in Lusaka, and I walked in there. There were two young engineers sitting inside, and I asked them, well, who do I speak to for your AVEX exports? And they're like, we're in the construction side of things. We build roads. And they're perfectly polite about it. They were scratching their heads like, why are you here asking about aircraft exports? Their implication being that you should be in China, why are you here? Even though these are aircraft being sold to Zambia. And in retrospect, if I have in another chance at interviews, I would rather be in China. Now the question is, even if I were in China, would the AVEC military aircraft side be willing to talk to me? That would be something else. And in terms of the variety of interview, I think one of the attendees asked who I was able to interview from. The Ministry of Defense in Zambia was obviously, I tried multiple times to get in touch with them, no success, but I had a lot more success by interviewing around them. So Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Development and Planning. And in the case of Zambia, because the Zambian Air Force has such a have so many different roles in Zambia in terms of development and housing, I actually got very good information by just interviewing regular citizens who had connections to the Zambian Air Force.
Okay, Elijah?
Thank you very much. I didn't talk to the Chinese because it was not very patent in my paper that I wanted to get the Chinese side, but I found something interesting which also makes me think that I should have talked to them actually, because when I went to one of the military bases, one of the Air Force military bases, they were quite secretive about what China has supplied. And when I followed that a bit, I also saw that actually when the US provides military support of any kind, aircraft and so on, it's in the papers, it's splashed in the papers. We have pictures of the military people in Kenya and the US, shaking hands and receiving it. But we never see this for China. And it's a question that I actually thought was interesting. Why are the Chinese so secretive about this? So it's an interesting part of Chinese military diplomacy, which got me curious about why the Chinese are so secretive about or worried about speaking about their military sales, which they are doing and doing well.
Okay, Tom, do you have?
Yeah, firstly, thanks obviously for all of those great comments about the report and some interesting questions coming in as well. On this question of Chinese interviewees, yes, I'm quite conscious that in that list I provided of people I spoke to, the Chinese side was very conspicuous by its absence. And for me, it's a similar story that I reached out to embassies in the relevant Chinese embassies in the countries I visited, and it was a combination of either no thank you or simply radio silence in response. So it definitely does seem that to be perfectly honest, not entirely surprised by this, but certainly it would appear to be a reticence about talking to quite external researchers on what is, of course, traditionally a pretty sensitive area. I think it's interesting the point that maybe going to source, going to China to talk about it might be able to answer perhaps some of the many very interesting questions that I would have loved to have been able to put to the Chinese officialdom. I did interview some Chinese economic actors present in the region, speaking from a perspective as Chinese citizens, and that was relevant to me, given that I did talk about, as you mentioned, some of the pull factors, the interests that require defending in the Chinese perception. In this case, Chinese citizens and companies present on the ground. And so I spoke to them about their perceptions, A, of the security situation overall, but B, importantly, how they felt that the party state would be willing to make an effort to protect them, which is something that the Chinese party state certainly is claiming it's willing to do. But yes, of course, if I could redo it all in an ideal way, I would have had interviews with all of those, with all those Chinese embassies and military attaches, of course.
Okay, we have not a lot of time left, so let me go to Jyhjong. Each of you, I'll ask a question or two from that have been posed, and give you a minute or two to speak to some of the points I raised if you want to do that. So for Jyhjong, one question is, what's the analysis of the impact of arms procurement on national politics in Zambia? And I guess you already have talked a little bit about the people you interviewed. And the second question, I guess, speaks to how the history factor plays into things. Does that mitigate negative stereotypes that there's this good history in the past and help deal with some of the tensions that might be caused by the economic relationship?
So I'll address that in sequence. So in terms of political impact, support for Zambian Air Force procurement, excluding business jets. Regular aircraft procurement are points of pride across the political divide. Sata, when he was elected president, he campaigned on a very anti-Chinese platform. And he was still elected, but it was also under his term that the L-15s were purchased. So it doesn't seem, in terms of politics between political party politics, this doesn't seem to be an issue. It has bipartisan support. There have been rumors, and I think that is what they are, of low-flying military aircrafts in Barotseland, which is a region of Zambia that has a secessionist movement. And there were accusations from the government critics that these low-flying jets are attempts to threaten the people of Barotseland. So now you bring up specters of, the selling weapon increases domestic oppression. And I don't think that report holds much water. One of the big giveaway was that the picture they used of those two flying jets, I did a reverse image search, and it turns out there are actually two US T-38 Talons published by the US Air Force from the Beale Air Force Base. So I'm just like, okay, probably not much water, but that is a concern. And in terms of anti-Chinese sentiment, I think someone brought it up. So we need to distinguish between Chinese government and AVEC, the Chinese companies. So as far as the Chinese government is under the umbrella of Belt Road Initiative, more contract is better, more contract value is better. That's the gold standard of measuring whether China is successful in Africa. But AVEC has, they're in a catch-22 position because they are one of, I wouldn't say one of the few companies, they are one of the largest companies, Chinese companies in Africa who decides to stay in Africa for long term. They have been cultivating their business in Zambia for a long time. And I think they're gradually coming to realize that a single-minded pursuit for more contract will only generate more anti-Chinese sentiment. So if they want to stay there for a long time, they have to let some of those contracts go. Like they can't just snap the big ones and the small ones. They might still go for the big ones. The small ones, if you can let the Zambian companies take it, let them take it. And last point about local relations, for AVEC is that they started out their business, especially their military aircraft exports, with a lot of reliance on loans. And I think they're gradually coming to the realization that if they want to stay in Zambia for long term, they can't endanger their local fiscal stability by offering more loans. So I think they are branching out into other ways of financing, such as public-private partnerships with the development projects and so on and so forth.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Elijah, you had a question that you answered in the chat, so I'm going to let that go. There's another question on interoperability of Chinese military hardware with systems from other countries. And so in your interviews, did you find that Chinese equipment gets modified or tailored to work with Russian or Western hardware that the militaries are already operating? And then if you have other comments that you want to make in response to what I said, you can have a little time to do that too.
With regard to interoperability, the answer I got was not specific to any one Russian or US, but the indication was that China is willing to do that. So I would assume that yeah, they do adapt them to become more interoperable with other systems from Europe and maybe the US. So they didn't give me very specific answers on exactly which country's equipment they change it to.
Okay, yeah, do you have any other comments? Bigger picture comments?
Yes. No, I think that the big question that I find is what's going to happen if the US wants to become more commercially successful. So I think the aircraft industry is one that is really, there's a lot of competition. So I've seen that the US has, for instance, relaxed some of its own rules regarding drone sales.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think basically this idea of the US becoming more commercially assertive, they just want to sell, is an interesting one for me. I think the US is sort of going to become more like China in terms of not being as strict as they were previously on the end user. So I think that is something that is interesting, and also that's something that is going to make China perhaps get into this sort of proxy conflict with the US in future, if the two big countries get into this alliancing mode, which is what the US wants, and which of course China has said it's not interested in.
Okay, no, that's a very good point. That's the fact that China's partnerships with countries don't include binding security commitments, and don't include as much on-the-ground assistance, is very different from the U.S. approach to the region, and I think that's a good point. Let me turn to Tom. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. You have 2 questions. One, what is the implications of the growing Chinese presence in West Africa for South Atlantic security? And then second, statement by Jean-Pierre Cabestan, training in China is usually not much valued by African military officers. In your interviews, do you see this view confirmed? And then also, if you want to speak to bigger questions, you can do that as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, time's a bit limited. I'll try and be quick. I have tried to answer a couple of the questions in writing there. On the South Atlantic security question, as I've just written, I do touch on that insofar as the possibility of a further Chinese military base following the Djibouti model, but this time brought over to the Atlantic coast. That would be the thing that would have the most direct impact on South Atlantic security. But here, when I'm talking about West Africa, as I mentioned in my comment there, I was focusing on the members of ECOWAS plus a couple of the adjacent states. And then swiftly over to Jean-Pierre's question. He's put a couple of interesting questions to me. I've just answered the training one. As I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, completely agree that overall there is certainly not very positive perceptions of the training of officers. The questions like prestige are really important. What I think is the case is that the scale of China's program is quite important. Maybe that then comes down to, is it quantity at the cost of quality? But the fact that China is training so many officers from so many different countries, I think, is quite an important factor. And Jean-Pierre, your question about the G5 Sahel, if I think we're out of time here, I'll send you an email answering that question, because it's a really interesting topic, and I'll share that with you. And if anybody else wants to put questions via email, please talk to the organizers to get my address. Thank you.
Great. Well, let me thank all the presenters. These are very rich papers. And as I said, I think we are into the 2nd or 3rd generation of scholarship on what China is doing in Africa. And it adds some of those factors, the comparative dimension, different analytic viewpoints, using both standard methods and standard data, but also a lot of data from individual research and interviews, and really trying to get on the ground to get perspectives from people in Africa. Elijah, you have a home field advantage. Others have to kind of come in and do that research on trips. But they're trying to do that, and I think that's a really important thing. I will also highlight, though, the difficulty of getting at what China is doing through interviews. Easy to find the statements, easy to find the position papers, easy to find the press conferences, but getting beyond that is more challenging. Several of you talked about it would be nice to be able to go to Beijing and do some of those interviews. And that may be something that gets harder to do in the future, at least for Westerners. So that's something to look forward to. But thank you very much for 3 very good papers. I learned something from all of them. And I guess with that, unless the organizers have something else to add, I think we are concluded. Or should I turn it back to the chair?
Just to say thank you to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we will have our keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.